The first day at her husband's home. The morning air in California was tinged with the promise of a new beginning as Lynn sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. The familiar buzz and distant palm trees that once symbolized youthful freedom now seemed foreign. Today, they bore a sense of responsibility she had never known in her own family home. The Nguyen family's two-story house awaited her like an imposing fortress, its elegant yet traditional stucco exterior suggesting both pride and untold expectations inside. Upon arrival, Lynn felt each step from the car to the front door keenly, the gravel crunching beneath her heels louder in her ears than her husband's gentle murmur. "It'll be fine." Stepping inside, a wave of incense and the faint aroma of simmering broth wrapped around her. A sensory reminder of the Vietnamese traditions her own parents had always taught her to respect, but which, she suspected, would take on a more rigid significance here. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Nguyen, emerged from the kitchen with a posture as erect as a ruler, and eyes that scanned Lynn from head to toe. There was no smile, only a polite nod. Her gaze silently conveyed a checklist of expectations: humility, resourcefulness, dexterity, and above all, obedience. The first words exchanged were formal, rehearsed, delivered in crisp Vietnamese out of respect for family elders. Lynn tried her best to respond appropriately, acutely aware of the scrutiny directed at her every gesture. She noticed how Mrs. Nguyen's glance lingered on the subtle Western cut of her dress before flickering away, as though measuring her daughter-in-law's Americanness on an invisible scale. Lynn's heart pounded with both hope and trepidation. After the initial introductions, the family sat together in the living room, surrounded by ancestral portraits and the soft humming of an old clock, a tangible reminder of the lineage and history Lynn was now a part of. Conversation revolved around domestic duties and traditions. Who would prepare breakfast, which chores were expected, and how certain holidays must be observed with utmost precision. With each detail, Lynn sensed another invisible brick being laid in the wall that separated family from outsider. Her husband, Daniel, remained by her side, but mostly silent, his role more that of an intermediary than an active participant. When Lynn struggled to recall the appropriate greeting for an elder cousin, Daniel quietly prompted her. Yet Mrs. Nguyen's slight frown made it clear. Lynn's inexperience would not be overlooked, no matter how minor. Throughout that long first day, Lynn oscillated between anticipation and anxiety. She searched for kindness in the smallest gestures, a cup of tea placed carefully on the table, the warmth of her father-in-law's brief smile. But such moments were rare, overshadowed by the constant, unspoken evaluation of her worth. Each interaction felt like a test, not just of her character, but of her understanding of a deep cultural code whose rules were rarely spoken aloud. As evening fell, Lynn stood by the kitchen window, watching the sky fade from orange to indigo. In this house, her new home, every word, every movement already felt significant. Yet underneath the fatigue, a small spark of resolve remained. Lynn would not let this intimidating beginning define her. Somewhere beyond the rituals and rules, she hoped there would be space to be accepted for who she was, not just as Daniel's wife, but as herself. The rigid family rules. Lynn awoke on her first full day in the Nguyen household before dawn, instinctively alert to the sounds of movement in the kitchen below. She hesitated at the edge of the unfamiliar bed, the sense of formality from her arrival still lingering heavily in the air. As she descended the staircase, careful to keep her footsteps light, she was greeted not by warm conversation, but by the meticulous choreography of an established routine, one she had never learned and was now expected to perform flawlessly. Mrs. Nguyen moved through the kitchen with unwavering precision, preparing breakfast the same way she had for decades. There was a rhythmic clatter of chopsticks and deft slicing of vegetables, all executed with almost ritualistic care. Lin witnessed this daily ballet from the doorway, uncertain when to offer assistance or when her presence might be an intrusion. Mrs. Nguyen's instructions were brief but pointed. The rice must be ready by 7. We do not use the rice cooker for jasmine rice, only the pot. The command, delivered without eye contact, was not merely a preference, but one of 1,000 unspoken laws. As the day unfolded, Lin quickly learned that every aspect of life in the Nguyen home was governed by strict regulation. Meals had to be taken at precise times. The family spoke Vietnamese at the table. English was reserved for outsiders and, implicitly, moments of minor disapproval. Each family member had an assigned chore, and deviations were swiftly and silently frowned upon. Lin was quietly reminded of her place when she reached for a dish before her elders had finished. No one explained the rules aloud, but mistakes were catalogued through a sharp glance or a withdrawn smile. The rules extended to clothing choices and even posture. On her way to help clear the table, Mrs. Nguyen corrected the angle at which Lin carried a serving tray, insisting, "In this family, we never rush. Grace is important." Housework assignments were issued each week, written in Vietnamese on a calendar pinned to the refrigerator. Lin noticed her name listed more often than Daniel's. Tasks ranged from ironing delicate ao dye to polishing silver heirlooms, tasks she had little experience with and was not permitted to alter. Evenings followed another set of rituals. The men watched the evening news in the den while the women cleaned quietly and prepared fruit for dessert. Conversations, even when light, steered towards the responsibilities of a daughter-in-law, the importance of keeping the family name untarnished, and subtle reminders about how proper women conduct themselves. Suggestions were always veiled as traditions rather than orders, but the implication was unmistakable. Deviation would not be tolerated. On weekends, the rules tightened further with visits from extended family or temple gatherings. Lin was expected to address each elder correctly, never speak unless spoken to, and answer questions about her upbringing and education with unwavering modesty. The older women whispered about her accent and modern haircut, comparing her silently to daughters-in-law from back home, where expectations were both higher and simpler, obedience and invisibility. Despite her repeated efforts to fulfill these roles, Lin often found herself the target of gentle correction or faint condescension. Daniel watched some of these moments in silence, never contradicting his mother or defending Lin outright. "She's just worried about the family's reputation," he would say later, as if to explain away the accumulation of small wounds. But Lin soon realized that understanding the rules was not enough. The true test was internalizing them until they became second nature, a process that felt both alien and suffocating. There were moments she felt resentment simmering, a longing for the easy laughter of her own family, the simple pleasure of eating takeout on a whim, the ability to speak her mind without fear of misstep. Here, her world was measured in carefully controlled gestures and unsmiling approval. Every day, a new lesson in invisibility and restraint. Regardless, Lin pressed on, determined not to let confusion show on her face. She practiced the old customs, repeating prayers at the household altar, memorizing her new schedule, and rehearsing the order of greetings. With each passing day, the web of rules around her thickened, tightening her place within the rigid structure of the Nguyen family, ever more cramped, ever more delicate. And yet, beneath her outward compliance, questions and doubt began to ferment. At what point, she wondered, did tradition stop being a source of comfort and become a means of quiet control? Lin knew she would need to answer that for herself. But for now, she could only move through the maze of rules, careful not to stumble, careful not to let hope flicker out. The line is drawn. In the weeks that followed, Lynn began to sense the boundaries within the Nguyen household, boundaries sharper than any rule written on the fridge calendar. Invisible lines seemed to snake through every room, separating not merely spaces but relationships. Mrs. Nguyen reinforced these divisions with quiet determination, her methods subtle yet unmistakable. It began with words, or rather, with silence punctuated by carefully chosen phrases. Conversations over family meals became minefields. Mrs. Nguyen wielded comparison like a weapon too familiar to ignore. "Your sister-in-law's congee is always just the right texture," she'd remark, casting the briefest glance at Lynn's steaming pot on the table. Or, during temple gatherings, she'd recall how Daniel's old girlfriend once folded paper lotus flowers with such delicate hands. Each memory delivered, though outwardly innocent, painted Lynn as lacking. The message was transparent. Nothing Lynn did was quite enough. No effort went unmeasured. Sometimes the criticisms were louder, dressed up as advice. "A good daughter-in-law always rises before her elders, even if she was up late finishing chores," Mrs. Nguyen would say within earshot of extended family, never looking at Lynn directly, but making sure the intended audience listened. Other times, it was a sigh too heavy, a smile too stiff, a compliment given to someone else for precisely what Lynn had labored over in vain. Worse than the comparisons were the moments Lynn felt her presence entirely dismissed. When a neighbor dropped by, Mrs. Nguyen would present household achievements as her own, or attribute them to her son, not mentioning Lynn's contributions at all. Birthdays and holidays became arenas for subtle humiliation. "We always made these dumplings by hand in Vietnam," Mrs. Nguyen would announce to relatives, only to shake her head when Lynn's folding technique faltered. Lynn's attempts at conversation were either redirected by a sharp change in topic or suffocated by a chorus of older voices, deaf to her stumbling efforts at humor or personal stories. Emotional manipulation followed quietly behind. When Daniel forgot an errand or missed a ritual, Mrs. Nguyen's disappointment always circled back to Lynn's lack of guidance, never held at her son's feet. "He was never forgetful before he got married," she'd tell her friends, a statement both casual and barbed. If Lynn tried to defend herself or offer explanation, Mrs. Nguyen's lips would thin. "In this family, we do not raise our voices. We show respect by accepting correction." To argue was to be disrespectful. To stay silent was to accept guilt. The impact on Lynn's marriage was both subtle and corrosive. Daniel grew quieter at home, weighed down by the tension he struggled to mediate. When Lynn gathered the courage to share her hurt, Daniel seemed torn between loyalty to his mother and empathy for his wife. "She's strict because she loves us," he rationalized. "She doesn't mean to hurt you. Try to understand." Lynn wanted to believe him, wanted to draw strength from the little encouragement he managed to offer. But the words felt thin, no match for the accumulating slights and doubts planted by each interaction with his mother. In the rare privacy of their own room, Daniel would sometimes apologize, brushing Lynn's hand and promising things would improve. But the pattern continued, his placations less convincing each time. Whether from cultural deference, filial piety, or simply habit, Daniel avoided direct confrontation with his mother. Lynn realized she was largely alone, not just in contending with the rules, but in fending off the attacks both veiled and open. As weeks turned into months, Lynn felt the line between family and outsider cement itself. Her role as a daughter-in-law was less an honor than a test, and she sensed that one misstep could banish her to perpetual outsider status. The physical house remained the same, but the atmosphere grew charged with a weight that pressed harder each day. Lynn wondered if any gesture, any sacrifice would ever be enough to cross the invisible threshold Mrs. Nguyen guarded so fiercely. But as these experiences accumulated, a stinging remark here, an omitted invitation there, Lynn began to keep mental tallies. She stopped making excuses for the slights, instead chronicling each wound, each injustice, inside herself. A quiet strength formed in the margins of her sorrow, fueled not by confrontation, but by clarity. Lynn saw clearly now. The line Mrs. Nguyen had drawn was not meant to be crossed, only endured, or perhaps, in time, dismantled. Alone, within her own family, Lynn had always believed that loneliness was reserved for the empty apartments of strangers in a new city or the quiet benches of a rainy afternoon. Not for the crowded kitchens and bustling living rooms of family homes, but here, under the same roof as her husband and his kin, the sensation seeped into her bones more deeply with every passing week. She was surrounded by people, yet truly alone. The signs of her isolation crept in quietly. It started with the small, almost imperceptible ways that her presence was overlooked. At dinner time, she noticed how conversations flowed around her, like water detouring around a stone in the riverbed. The older women might pause mid-laughter as she entered the room, sharing a look that was unreadable except for the faint tightening at the corners of their mouths. She knew, in those silences, that she was not a conspirator, only a tolerated guest. That painful awareness grew sharper during family gatherings, when the extended family came for Sunday lunch or temple holidays. The house filled with noise, children chasing each other down carpeted hallways, uncles boasting about old business, aunts gossiping in Vietnamese about the price of fish or the latest scandal back home. Lynn floated through these events, her American upbringing and halting Vietnamese setting her apart. When she attempted a story or laughed a little too loudly, the conversation would waver, sometimes dying altogether. Her words seemed to evaporate before they reached anyone's ears. It became easier to fade into the background. She busied herself with dishes and errands, grateful for tasks that spared her the effort of futile small talk. She found comfort, or something like it, in the monotony of chopping vegetables, matching socks, and folding laundry. Silent, repetitive motions that required no approval and offered no risk of failure. Each completed task was a momentary respite from the eyes and the judgments that otherwise pressed in from all sides. Yet even in her so-called refuge, Lynn felt the biting cold of exclusion. If she lingered in the kitchen too long, one of the older women might remark that she was slowing down the work. If she finished too quickly, someone would suggest she was careless or rushing. There was no right way to exist here, only a maze of quietly shifting standards, all defined by someone else. Even Daniel, her husband, grew distant. He had taken to staying late at work when he could, or hiding behind his phone. On the rare nights he joined her in their small bedroom, tiredness wrapped around him like armor. When Lynn confided in him about feeling unwelcome, about wanting reassurance, he offered her an awkward sort of sympathy and a pat on the hand. "It'll get better," he would say, his voice muffled by exhaustion and habit. "They need time to get used to you." But even as he said it, Lynn could hear the doubt underlying his words, a truth neither wanted to acknowledge. She reached out to the past, calling old friends from college and distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. But even these conversations felt thin, strained by distance and the relentless churn of daily responsibilities. Her parents, now living several states away, encouraged her to be patient and try her best to fit in. Their advice, well-intentioned, felt hollow, delivered from the comfort of their own familiar routines, far removed from the scrutiny Lynn lived under each day. Holidays were the hardest. The first New Year she spent with the Nguyen family was a blur of activity, yet for Lynn, it was marked most by a series of invisible walls. She watched as Mrs. Nguyen organized the ceremonial altar with deft, practiced hands, delegating tasks to daughters, daughters-in-law, and short-term guests, but rarely to Lynn. She helped where she could, her movements careful, her smile practiced, and all the while she felt her real self recede, replaced by a courteous mannequin. On the day itself, as the family gathered for the traditional meal, Lynn found herself at one end of the table, a position reserved for newcomers and those outside the inner circle. To her left, the laughter was easy, the conversation quick. To her right, there was only the steady clink of chopsticks and the rustle of paper napkins. Through it all, Lynn's mind drifted to New Year's past, at home with her parents, where the meal was sometimes takeout pho and the laughter loud, even irreverent. Now, every gesture, how she poured tea, where she set the serving spoons, carried the weight of scrutiny. Sometimes in the late evening, after the house was finally quiet, Lynn crept to the backyard, drawing her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders, and looked up at the sky. She missed the sense of belonging she had once taken for granted. The stars above California were cold and unfamiliar, scattered so widely that she could not find the constellations she'd known as a girl. She tried to bridge the separation in small ways. She suggested watching a movie as a family or inviting her own friends over for dinner. Each proposal was received with polite disinterest or else ignored altogether. Mrs. Nguyen always offered some justification. The house was too busy, outsiders would disrupt their schedule, or, most cutting of all, maybe next time, when you've settled in better. The message, always implied, was that Lynn had not yet earned the privilege of truly belonging. The few friends she had made in California were sympathetic, but their own family pressures left little time for more than the occasional sympathetic text. "Hang in there," they wrote. "It's just part of being a daughter-in-law." Sometimes, Lynn wondered if this was really the fate of all women who married into families so ironclad in tradition. Was invisibility just the price of being accepted? Isolation magnified her every insecurity. She found herself second-guessing her words, her gestures, even her silences. She grew shy about asking for small favors or expressing preferences. At the temple, she watched other women, seemingly confident, chat with ease. She wondered what they saw when they looked at her, an outsider, reluctant, unsure. She began to fear that the self-assured young woman who had fallen in love with Daniel and dared to build a new life across the country had vanished entirely. Amid the isolation was a deeper ache, the feeling of losing her own identity, squeezed and pressed by the demands of family, tradition, and silent expectation. Some evenings she caught her own reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman who stared back. Eyes shadowed, shoulders tense, wearing a dress chosen for her by someone else. Still, she endured, clinging to the hope that, as her mother reminded her, strong roots weather any storm. But each day, she asked herself, what happens if the roots themselves are not welcome in this soil? Despite the sense of defeat, a restless question rose within her. Was she alone because she did not belong, or because she refused to lose herself entirely in a world that demanded blindness and silence? The answer, Lynn realized in the cold hush of her room, might be the only thing that kept her hope alive. The turning point. Secrets revealed. The days in the Nguyen household tumbled onward, marked by quiet tensions and a routine that pressed Lynn deeper into invisibility. She moved through the house with careful steps, afraid that a misjudged gesture or misplaced word could become fodder for judgment. It was in this state, isolated and braced against further disappointment, that Lynn stumbled upon the quiet current of secrets running beneath the surface of her new family. It started with a box, plain, battered, and wedged at the back of a seldom-used closet in the spare bedroom. Lynn had been sent to change the sheets for a cousin's upcoming visit, one of the endless chores delegated to her. As she tugged the heavy winter quilt from the shelf, the box fell with a dull thud, spilling open to reveal a jumble of old photographs, brittle letters in Vietnamese, and the dusty medallions of a life lived long before Lynn arrived. The voice of Mrs. Nguyen calling from the hall startled her into gathering the stray contents hastily, but curiosity, so long suppressed by duty, won out. That night, when the family retired and the house grew still, Lynn returned to the closet. There among the keepsakes, she found evidence of a vibrant past. Photographs of a much younger Mrs. Nguyen, smiling beside a tall, handsome man Lynn barely recognized. Candid shots from a crowded market in Vietnam. Letters written in a rounded, feminine hand, addressed to names unfamiliar to Lynn. Piecing together broken phrases from the yellowed papers, Lynn began to sense the shape of a buried pain. Lines alluded to betrayal, family loss, unreachable hopes, and years of hard sacrifice. One letter, torn at the edge, spoke of a sister lost in the chaos of immigration and the bitterness of family debt unresolved. Another, more recent, was addressed to Min, a name Lynn recalled from a hushed argument months earlier. Beneath these words was a grief both raw and concealed, a complexity that made sense only in the light of Mrs. Nguyen's rigidity. Yet the biggest secret was not in the past. Mingled with the letters were more contemporary records, doctor's bills, official notices, and a sealed envelope containing a photograph of a woman Lynn had seen only once, leaving the Nguyen home with an expression much like Lynn's own, an outsider bearing a silent wound. Her name, scrawled in a quick hand on the back, was Lan. Sifting through fragments of conversations now recalled with new clarity, Lynn pieced together the likelihood that Mrs. Nguyen had estranged an elder daughter before Lynn married Daniel. Perhaps Lan had been the first to rebel against the inflexible rules, the first casualty of a mother's unyielding vision for her family's honor. Lynn felt suddenly unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The criticisms, the impossible demands, the constant reminders that she was not enough. They were no longer simple acts of domination, but rituals of defense, a fortress built atop disappointments too bitter to name aloud. For the first time, Lynn no longer saw Mrs. Nguyen solely as a harsh judge. Instead, she glimpsed a woman shaped by loss and denied comfort, burdened by the trauma of exile and the desperate need to preserve a fragile sense of belonging. In the days that followed, Lynn viewed her mother-in-law anew. She observed Mrs. Nguyen's careful movements in the kitchen and the almost imperceptible softening when she handled old family heirlooms. She noticed how Mrs. Nguyen lingered over her husband's brief praise, her expression flickering with hope before resuming its usual severity. Bits of overheard conversation, worries about money, about younger cousins in Vietnam, the fate of a distant sibling, hinted at anxieties woven into the fabric of everyday life. Lynn realized that Mrs. Nguyen's strictness toward her was not just an assertion of power, but an attempt to impose order where her life had spun, again and again, into chaos. Tentatively, Lynn began to ask gentle questions about the past. The first responses were brusque. "It's nothing for you to worry about," Mrs. Nguyen snapped, closing herself like a shell. But one rainy afternoon, as Lynn quietly brewed tea, Mrs. Nguyen's defenses faltered. She recounted fragments of her journey to America, the loss of her parents in the war, nights spent working triple shifts, the sharp-edged loneliness of starting over in a new world. She did not speak of Lan, nor did she explain the letters, but her voice trembled with an ache Lynn recognized. As empathy softened Lynn's view, resentment gave way to understanding. Still, this discovery did not erase Lynn's own pain. If anything, the realization deepened her sense of tragedy, the way trauma transmits itself, silent and corrosive, from generation to generation. Lynn saw now how the mechanisms that suffocated her were also the armor Mrs. Nguyen wore to protect herself from further loss. If Mrs. Nguyen's rules had once seemed arbitrary, they now echoed with the desperation of someone trying to control the uncontrollable. Yet Lynn understood, too, that knowing the root of suffering, is not the same as forgiving the suffering inflicted. The wounds cut both ways. Lynn's own spirit had wilted in the sunless world of her mother-in-law's expectations, and Daniel had turned inward, numbed by trying to please both women and succeeding with neither. The box of secrets became a quiet talisman for Lynn, a reminder both of the humanity within the rigid walls she faced and of the cost such walls demand of everyone behind them. For the first time, Lynn allowed herself to consider that her struggle was not merely personal. The toxic currents running beneath the surface of daily life were part of a much older and broader story, a cycle she might, with enough courage, dare to break. One evening, standing by the window as she watched fog roll across the empty street, Lynn made a private decision. She would not let herself be flattened by the pain she now understood lay at the root of her mother-in-law's actions, nor would she allow injustice to become acceptable simply because it was familiar. Something in her had changed. She wanted the truth to breathe, to be known, not as an act of vengeance, but as an act of freedom, for herself, for Daniel, and perhaps some small way, even for Mrs. Nguyen. Armed with a clear, unsentimental vision of the family's struggles, Lynn began to prepare, not for confrontation, but for revelation. She would speak not only her own suffering, but the deeper wounds of the house they all inhabited. The time was coming soon. A family gathering, a festival, a moment of reckoning. The secrets, once tucked away in the dark corners of a closet, would become her unlikely source of strength. Patience pushed to the limit. In the soft gray hours before dawn, Lynn moved through the sleeping house with practiced care, every footstep measured, every sound muffled. A trembling sense of anticipation, sharp and persistent, had kept her from drifting into real sleep all night. Something in the air, not entirely new, but heavier than before, made the walls seem closer, the house less a home than a box bracing for rupture. She remembered her mother's words about patience as a form of strength, but beneath Lynn's steady exterior, a storm gathered. Tensions in the Nguyen household had been smoldering for weeks since Lynn first uncovered the family's well-guarded secrets. Nothing outward had changed. If anything, Mrs. Nguyen was even more careful, keeping Lynn close, but never close enough to trust, doling out responsibilities and discipline in equal measure. But Lynn could feel the ground trembling beneath her, the sense that the family's rituals were unraveling quietly at their seams. The unraveling began, as it often did, with a misunderstanding. It was just after a Saturday breakfast, when everyone was present and the kitchen buzzed with the clamor of voices and clinking dishes. Mrs. Nguyen's oldest friend was visiting, a woman whose opinions, Lynn had quickly learned, were treated like gospel in the extended family. The table was laden with bowls of steaming soup, freshly fried dough, delicate fruit sliced to a specific symmetry, and the air was tight with the unspoken pressure for everything to be perfect. Daniel, distracted by work emails on his phone, accidentally spilled a cup of hot tea as Lynn reached across him to pass the scallion pancakes. The splash was minor, but it stained the crisp white tablecloth, one embroidered with the Nguyen crest by Mrs. Nguyen herself decades ago. There was a beat of stunned silence as everyone stared at the spreading mark. Mrs. Nguyen's eyes cut to Lynn, sharp as shrapnel. "I told you, always pour for the elders first, and always clear the area," she said, voice measured but cool. "We have simple rules here, Lynn. Is it so difficult?" It was understood that Lynn was to accept the scolding in front of everyone, as countless times before, but the irony, the very rules Mrs. Nguyen imposed had forced Lynn to reach across the table, caught in Lynn's throat. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Apologies would not suffice. Explaining would be defensive, another grave sin in the household. Mrs. Nguyen's Friend offered an overly sympathetic sigh. Young women today have no sense of tradition, she said, patting Mrs. Nguyen's hand in a gesture of solidarity. The other relatives at the table looked away or down at their plates, unwilling to meet Lin's gaze. Daniel said nothing. He slumped further into his seat, the phone suddenly fascinating. Lin stood there, feeling her cheeks burn, every muscle held tightly in check. In years past, Lin would have choked back her humiliation. She would have locked the moment away with so many others, an invisible tally in the ledger of grievances she carried alone. But today, the patience her parents had praised, her mother's mantra of just endure, just one more day, felt like a noose tightening around her will. She excused herself, set down the dishes, and slipped outside, the sound of her exit swallowed by the scene inside. She spent the rest of the day moving through her chores as if underwater, numb to the shrill commands, the passive-aggressive advice, the tales Mrs. Nguyen spun about the glories of daughters-in-law from back home. In each spared moment, Lin's thoughts sharpened, memories of nights hunched by the window with nothing but her old journal for company, of her father's quiet encouragements to never lose herself for anyone, echoed from a distance she could no longer bridge, and of the shoebox of painful secrets upstairs, now a cold comfort. The breaking point arrived that evening, precipitated by an even pettier disaster. Mrs. Nguyen had entrusted Lin with preparing the altar for an important ancestral ceremony, a task layered with symbolism best not misunderstood. Lin researched every step, reverently polishing the brass candlesticks, arranging the offerings, checking the prayer sheets twice over. But Mrs. Nguyen's inspection was merciless. She found a single marigold out of place, declared the entire offering disrespectful, and swept the arrangement aside in front of the assembled family. "You see now?" she told the relatives, her voice loud enough for the entire house. Without proper upbringing, a woman cannot maintain a family's dignity. Our ancestors, how would they bless us with this kind of neglect? The public rebuke splintered the last of Lin's composure, hot shame mixed with anger, grief with a bitter sense of injustice. Her hands shook as she cleaned up the offerings, tears stinging her eyes. She noticed, though, that not every face in the room was hostile. Daniel's father gave her a small nod that might have been sympathy. A younger cousin looked away, as if embarrassed on her behalf. These details stayed with Lin through the long hours that night, replaying alongside memories of every slight and every unattended kindness. Sitting alone at the edge of her bed, Lin was beset by a war inside herself, between hope and despair, tradition and individual worth. She reviewed her own role in events, questioning herself. Why had she stayed silent? Why had she chosen submission over self-respect? And yet, she also remembered her discovery in the closet, the truth no one would speak, the pain at the heart of the family's false perfection. Her mind would not rest. She thought of her mother-in-law's hidden griefs, but for once, they did not eclipse her own. She realized, finally, enduring cruelty is not the same as being honorable. Patience, when abused, is not a virtue, but a prison. As the sun crept up, Lin could feel her exhaustion transforming into resolve. The outlines of her old, patient self blurred, overtaken by something harder, a new insistence on dignity and truth, no matter the fallout. She told herself, quietly at first, then aloud in the dawn silence, enough. The next slight would not be absorbed. The next humiliation would not be met with forbearance. The time had come to defend herself, not only for her sake, but for the buried selves of all the women who had been demanded to disappear for the family's honor. Steeling herself, Lynn began to outline a plan. She needed allies, evidence, and the courage to expose the truth, even if it shattered the fragile peace. For the first time since entering the Nguyen home, Lynn felt as though she was choosing her own direction, not waiting for acceptance, but demanding to be seen. Her patience had always been praised as proof of her goodness. Now she saw it as the key to her own undoing. That morning, Lynn rose with the first full glimmer of rebellion, a determination that the next chapter of her life would not be written by someone else's rules. Planning the showdown, a clever counterattack. Lynn's decision, once made, felt like a sudden cut, sharp and liberating. She spent days testing the strength of this new defiance, nurturing her resolve into something more than a fleeting burst of anger. No more would she simply absorb the indignities quietly, or allow herself to be bent and shaped by someone else's notion of worth. The path ahead was unknown, but there was clarity in knowing she had finally chosen to act. Gone was the Lynn who walked on eggshells. She observed the patterns of household life as if from a distance, but her attention was honed, seeking leverage that could tip the balance in her favor. Mrs. Nguyen's world was built on outward perfection and inner secrets, and Lynn understood now that this fragile equilibrium depended on silence. To win back her own voice, she realized she needed not only courage, but also a plan, a counterattack both strategic and wise. The first step was gathering evidence. Lynn became methodical, collecting proof of her efforts and the unfairness she endured. She began keeping a detailed journal, noting each hurtful comment, each instance where her hard work was undermined or erased. She discreetly photographed the bruises on her hands after hours of scrubbing, the immaculate dinners that were dismissed in public, and the calendar that assigned her triple the chores given to Daniel. She kept every passive-aggressive note Mrs. Nguyen left in the kitchen or tucked under her door. She found unlikely moments of alliance with Daniel's father, Mr. Nguyen, a reserved man usually overshadowed by his wife's commanding presence. He was not one to interfere, but Lynn sensed a gentle sympathy behind his quiet. She started engaging him in conversation, asking about family history, about his memories from Vietnam, about the subtle joys and regrets that shaped his life. Gradually, he opened up, sharing perspectives that revealed cracks in the family's rigid edifice. When Lynn asked about his hopes for the future, he surprised her. "I want peace, not just quiet, but real peace. No more women suffering in my house." The words struck Lynn as both confession and encouragement. Next, Lynn subtly sought support from her younger cousin-in-law, Mai, a college student whose watchful eyes missed little, but whose rebellious streak was hidden behind dutiful smiles. During chores or shared errands, Lynn gently alluded to her own struggles, testing for solidarity. To Lynn's relief, Mai responded with empathy and stories of her own about how she dreaded one day facing the same suffocating expectations. Having found these soft alliances, Lynn began strategizing how to navigate the swirling currents of the greater family. She knew timing was critical. The yearly family festival was approaching, a day when dozens of relatives would gather for ancestral rites, feasting, and gossip. The pressure on Mrs. Nguyen to present a flawless family image would be immense. Lynn chose this occasion for her move, knowing that the weight of many witnesses could tip sympathies in unexpected directions. Preparation consumed her days. She practiced her English and Vietnamese greetings, ensuring her words would carry the right resonance to all generations. She rehearsed telling her story aloud in private, banishing the tremble from her voice. At night, she pored over her secret box of evidence, arranging documents and photos in a folder that could be produced if her integrity was questioned. More than anything, Lynn worked to manage her emotions. Her anger was real and justified, but she recognized that outrage alone would not win her the respect or understanding she sought. She meditated each morning, drawing on her mother's teachings to steady herself. She journaled nightly, sorting through her desires for justice, for compassion, and for hope. For herself, but also for a broken family that didn't know how to care for its own. On the eve of the gathering, Lynn quietly reached out to several relatives she knew to be more open-minded. An aunt with whom she had once shared a confidant's silence, a cousin who worked as a social worker, and even one of Daniel's old school friends who had married into a similarly traditional family but created a bridge between generations through honesty. She asked if she could share her experiences just for their understanding. To her relief, each offered support in small, significant ways, affirming that her perceptions were not wild imaginings, but the product of real patterns and problems. Throughout her preparation, Lynn was careful not to alienate Daniel, even in her frustration over his passivity. She decided to confide in him, presenting her gathered evidence and outlining her plan not as an ultimatum, but as a necessity. "This is for me, but also for us," she said. "I can't live with silence anymore. I need to be heard. If you can't stand with me, I'll do it alone. But I hope you'll choose to be by my side." Daniel, overwhelmed, hesitated, but there was a glimmer of resolve in his eyes, a longing to finally step out from under the weight of family expectation and become a true partner. He promised to think and to be present wherever that led him. The morning of the family festival dawned with a nervous calm. Lynn wore a simple dress of her own choosing, refusing at last the borrowed dye pressed on her by Mrs. Nguyen. She moved through the house with a quiet purpose, setting out food, arranging offerings, welcoming guests with a genuine smile. Daniel's father offered her a nod of encouragement, and Mai squeezed her hand discreetly. When the extended family assembled and the ritual commenced, Lynn waited until the formal prayers ended and everyone settled around the big table. The air was thick with the scents of incense and roasted meat, laughter and polite chatter swirling through the rooms. Mrs. Nguyen, in her element, presided at the head of the table, sharp-eyed and relentless, determined to control the narrative. Then Lynn stood. She cleared her throat, steady and deliberate. The noise faded and all eyes turned. In measured Vietnamese, Lynn began. "Today, we gather to honor our ancestors, to celebrate not only our family's legacy, but the dignity of every member who helps maintain it. I would like to speak my truth, not to cause harm, but in the hope that honesty might heal what silence has broken." The words that followed drew from her journal, her evidence, her pain, and newly, her hope. She recounted, without venom, the double standards in the household, the burdens disproportionately placed upon her shoulders, the quiet cruelties excused in the name of tradition. At critical moments, she produced her supporting photographs and notes. She acknowledged Mrs. Nguyen's sacrifices and suffering, showing genuine respect even as she revealed the cost of perpetuating trauma, on herself and on others, from Mai to the story of Lan, the estranged daughter whom silence had banished. As Lynn's voice rang through the stunned hush, emotions flashed across the gathered family. Disbelief, shame, and unexpected understanding. Some averted their eyes, others sat straighter, listening, their own private wounds echoing Lynn's. Daniel stood, voice wavering but firm, and quietly supported his wife's words. "Lynn speaks for many. It's time our family listened." For the first time, Lynn felt the powerful, weighty satisfaction of being seen on her own terms. The battle ahead would likely be hard, but today she had found her voice. Her careful, clever planning, her alliances, her strategy, her search for empathy over anger, had turned the family's rules inside out exposing the line between tradition and tyranny, and inviting all to cross into a more honest future. Truth unveiled at the Grand Festival. The Grand Festival at the Nguyen home had always been a spectacle, an annual gathering marked by abundance, ritual, and most especially, careful choreography. Each detail was a testament to Mrs. Nguyen's steely oversight. The platters of food arranged just so, the gleaming ancestral altar, the parade of visiting relatives who spoke with equal parts pride and nostalgia about tradition. Yet on this day, for the first time in memory, the festival spun on a new axis. One Linh herself had set in motion. The moment Linh finished speaking, a vast hush fell over the room, unsettling as a dropped glass. Even the youngest children froze. Linh stood tall, her words still hanging in the air, heart pounding so loudly she could hardly hear the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. For years, she had been trained to shrink herself within this house. Now all eyes were trained on her, uncertain and searching. The first response was not words, but a sharp inhale, a collective drawing of breath, as if the whole family had been holding it in for years. Mrs. Nguyen's face had gone completely still, lips pressed in a pale line, her hands locked tightly in her lap. She glanced at her husband as if daring him to intervene, then swept her gaze across the gathering, hunting for support. But most faces, relatives young and old, aunties visiting from San Jose, cousins home for the summer, wore the same expression of shock and unease. "I didn't expect," Mrs. Nguyen began, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly. But Linh, and perhaps everyone else, understood that even Mrs. Nguyen didn't know how to continue. Silence weighed on the room, a silence finally broken by Mr. Nguyen's deep, steady voice. "We have all seen how hard Linh tries," he said, almost gently, breaking a rule of decades by siding against his wife, even in so soft a way. "Perhaps this is a chance to listen, not only to tradition, but to what needs to change." The others murmured, some in confusion, some in relief. Mai, emboldened by Lin's courage, spoke up from the far end of the table. "It's not just Linh. Sometimes I'm scared too. I wish I could be more honest with all of you, but I'm afraid of disappointing the family." There it was, the ripple Linh had hoped for. Truth, fragile but now public, circling the room. Far from the tidy order that always reigned at the festival, a subtle chaos bloomed. Some relatives let out quiet sighs, their stoic masks cracking. Others exchanged long, meaningful looks, as though seeing each other clearly for the first time. The oldest aunt cleared her throat. "We buried so much to keep the image," she said in accented English, "but what did we lose along the way?" Still, the weight of Mrs. Nguyen's authority did not dissolve easily. She rose from her seat, dignity collected like an armor. "You shame the family, Linh. You bring up old pain in front of strangers. Why? What you say may be true for you, but why force us all to bear it? This isn't the Nguyen way." Her voice quivered between scolding and pleading, old wounds exposed and raw. But Linh did not step back. "We carry the pain either way, Mother," she replied, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We always have. We can dress it up with respect and rituals, but it doesn't go away. Maybe I was wrong to stay silent, but I'm not wrong to want better for all of us, not just for myself." Daniel, his face flushed with shame and hope, stood up at last. "She's right. I never defended you, Linh. I'm sorry. We keep saying family is everything, but I let you be alone in ours." His admission was small but seismic, a signal for the others to accept their roles, however passive or complicit. Around the table, more voices awoke, sharing quiet admissions, awkward apologies, confessions of friction and resentment previously masked by ceremonial smiles. The process was messy. At times, conversations overlapped with old family dramas resurfacing, generations' worth of expectations clashing with the ache for change. Still, some could not bring themselves to cross the line, shaking their heads or clicking their tongues in disapproval. But most listened, and the truth gathered momentum. Mrs. Nguyen's composure faltered as her relatives, her sisters, her niece, her own husband, gently acknowledged Lin's experience as real, if uncomfortable. The old forms of control now appeared brittle beside the urgency of what was newly spoken. A weary admission that sometimes love warped into something dangerous when filtered through too much pride and too little understanding. As night deepened, ritual yielded to raw conversation. Cousins sat with Lin and Mai, offering gratitude for their courage. Daniel's father poured Lin a cup of tea, his hands slightly trembling, whispering, "We have all suffered, but suffering in silence doesn't make us noble." The children, sensing the tension had transformed, ran and laughed, no longer hushed by the threat of discipline. The festival meal, so often staged for the sake of family image, felt different. Each bite and gesture was less formal, conversation candid and, at times, awkwardly vulnerable. Lin felt both exhausted and light, as if she had run a great distance carrying something heavy, and now, at last, could set it down. She did not know what changes would last beyond this night, but she was certain that something fundamental had shifted. Her story was no longer a shameful secret, nor, for the first time, simply her burden to bear. Even Mrs. Nguyen, pride battered but not destroyed, retreated to the backyard for a moment of privacy. Lin watched her from the window and caught a flicker of the woman behind all the expectation, a mother who had survived loss, war, and loneliness, and who had clung to control when love felt too unpredictable. Whether Mrs. Nguyen would forgive Lin or ever give up her old ways remained uncertain. But the confrontation had stripped away some of her certainty, some of the sharp edge of absolute rightness. In her silence, there was finally ambiguity. The festival's end brought no clear resolution. Some relatives left early, uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Others lingered, seeking Lin out for quiet words, hands squeezed in shared understanding. Daniel, shaken but somehow freed, wrapped Lin in an embrace that felt real in a way it hadn't for months. Long after the last guest departed, Lin sat at the altar alone, incense trailing silver ribbons through the dark. She found herself thinking of Lan, the sister banished by tradition, and said a silent prayer for her and for all the family wounds left unspoken. The festival had not healed them. Not yet. But as Lin pressed her hand to her heart, she knew the hardest part was over. The truth, once spoken, could not be returned to silence. Consequences and change. In the days that followed the festival, the Nguyen household felt both familiar and utterly changed. On the surface, routines persisted. Mrs. Nguyen rose early to tend the shrine. Mr. Nguyen read his paper at the kitchen table. Lin moved through chores with habitual care. Yet beneath every ordinary moment stirred the memory of truths that had finally been spoken aloud. Fallout came swiftly, as Lin knew it would. Some relatives, affronted by what they considered a breach of filial decorum, withdrew in cool silence. A few aunts returned home after the festival without saying goodbye. The Sunday phone calls Lin had once observed in the background, long-distance check-ins filled with gossip and manufactured cheer, grew terser. When Mrs. Nguyen answered, her voice was flatter, stripped of the brittle pride that had once colored every word. Only once did Lin overhear her mother-in-law defending her own actions. "I only wanted what was best for the family." It came out almost as a question. Daniel, for his part, became hesitant but attentive. The day after the festival, he lingered at the breakfast table while Lynn poured tea, clearing his throat several times before the words came. "I'm sorry, truly sorry for not seeing you, not defending you. I thought that if I stayed quiet, it would get better. But silence was its own choice, wasn't it?" He looked nervous, almost embarrassed, but also lighter than Lynn had seen him in years. For the first time, he asked, "What do you want, Lynn? How can I help?" The question felt momentous, and she hesitated before answering, learning again what it meant to speak her true desires aloud. "I want a marriage that is equal. I want my voice to matter. I want to feel at home, not trapped." Real change, Lynn soon realized, moved slowly. The family's old ways could not be banished by a single confrontation, no matter how honest or brave. Yet the air seemed different now, less oppressive. Mrs. Nguyen, nursing the wounds of a lost authority, avoided Lynn for several days, bustling noisily through the house but rarely stopping in any one room for too long. Yet the sudden outburst diminished. No new lessons were delivered in front of the family. Lynn's cooking and cleaning were accepted without criticism, if not quite with praise. Even the weekly chore list seemed more balanced, Daniel's name appearing for a fair share of duties. The changes were small, but to Lynn, they felt revolutionary. Still, the consequences rippled outward. The oldest uncle, stern and deeply traditional, reprimanded Mrs. Nguyen on the phone, scolding her for losing control of your own house. But more than once, Lynn noticed younger family members, cousins, nieces, even Mai, approaching her quietly, some with gratitude, others just to check in. "You gave us all permission to breathe," one whispered on the front steps after dinner. "My mother says it was shameful." "I think it was brave." Mrs. Nguyen herself changed in ways that were painful to watch. She moved more slowly, sometimes lingering at the altar long after incense had burned itself out. Once, Lynn found her sitting with an old photograph, one Lynn recognized from the secret box, and for a moment their eyes met. Pain flickered there, but not anger, and Lynn heard, as if from a great distance, a softer version of the woman who had ruled the house. "It's hard, letting go of right and wrong. All I ever had was rules." Lynn didn't answer, but left a cup of tea at her side, gentle and wordless. Some fractures healed, or at least softened. Daniel's father began spending more time in the kitchen, offering stories about his own youth in Vietnam. "I was scared too, you know. Scared to lose my father's respect. Scared to fail," he admitted one evening, the two of them shelling peas side by side. "But what you did took real courage. Maybe it's time for all of us to find some." Mai became Lynn's closest ally, her voice growing stronger after the festival. She challenged her own parents when they joked about obedient daughters, and she insisted on inviting Lynn along to family outings, refusing to let shame dictate participation any longer. "We're different from our mothers, but we still carry their dreams," she said once in Lynn's room, painting her nails. "Maybe now we can carry their hopes too, not just their fears." Yet not everything transformed. Some relatives kept their distance, uncertain or disapproving. In awkward moments at temple gatherings or family meals, an older aunt might sigh dramatically, casting a pointed glance Lynn's way. Once, an uncle joked about too much American independence, laughter brittle around the table. Lynn learned to take these with a calm that surprised her, neither rising to defend herself nor shrinking away. The worst of fear, she realized, was gone. Within herself, something shifted too. Lynn discovered an unexpected appetite for freedom. Small at first, but growing. She began reading again in the evenings, novels and essays set aside during her first months of marriage. She called her parents and spoke honestly, even about the festival and its aftermath. Their advice was careful, reassuring, but for the first time, Lynn sensed that she could listen with both affection and discernment, choosing what fit her reality and letting the rest fall away. In time, the family found a new rhythm. Meals were quieter, but no longer strained. Small courtesies, please, thank you, a gentle touch on the shoulder, returned to the daily routine, suggesting affection where there had only been obligation. Mrs. Nguyen, though changed and chastened, began, haltingly, to include Lynn in conversations about the future, plans for the next festival, how best to help younger cousins acclimate to America, even shared laughter at a neighbor's misadventures. Sometimes, Lynn glimpsed a maternal warmth she'd never been allowed to approach before. As the seasons shifted and the festival's memory faded from daily life, Lynn recognized that real acceptance would always be elusive for some in the family. But what mattered now was that she had found acceptance within herself. She was no longer waiting for permission to belong or for praise that would never come. The house would never return to its old equilibrium, but in the storm's wake, a more honest peace had begun to take root. Fragile, perhaps, but finally real. And at night, sometimes, Lynn would light a single stick of incense at the family altar and whisper prayers, not just for the family she'd married into, but for herself, for strength, for gentleness, for the freedom to be fully seen and loved, even in all her imperfection. A new beginning and the lesson of courage. Months passed since the festival upheaval that had changed the Nguyen family forever. Spring crept over California with subtle, insistent warmth. Lynn awoke most mornings to the scent of orange blossoms drifting in from the neighbor's yard, mingling with the familiar aroma of strong coffee and rice porridge. Where once she had braced herself for each day, steeling her nerves against the invisible currents of judgment, she now felt a lighter anticipation, as if the air itself whispered, "Things can change if you're brave enough to begin." At first, Lynn's newfound confidence was cautious, nearly fragile. She still completed her chores and respected family routines, but there was no longer the frantic energy of trying to constantly please. She spoke more, laughed more, and allowed her real opinions to surface, even if they contradicted the old ways. Sometimes Daniel sought her out in the kitchen and asked her advice, or simply shared his own day's frustrations. "I like when you disagree with me," he once joked, nudging her arm. "At least I know you're really here." That small acknowledgement was more precious to Lynn than any praise. In the wake of the festival, certain family bonds quietly rewove themselves. Mrs. Nguyen, though still proud, seemed slower to judge. She stopped making barbed comparisons to other daughters-in-law. The two women never explicitly discussed their old tensions, and Lynn sensed that some wounds were still too raw to touch directly. But in dozens of small ways, a shared recipe, an offer of tea without prompting, a soft smile at the table, their relationship thawed. One afternoon, as they pinched dumplings together for a cousin's engagement party, Mrs. Nguyen finally spoke, her words slow but sincere. "You remind me of my eldest, Lan, strong, even when it's not easy. I wish I'd listened more when I was her mother." The confession left Lynn speechless, her heart tight with the bittersweet gift of understanding. Daniel changed, too. No longer content to be a passive bystander, he became Lynn's quiet champion. If his mother started to criticize, he'd gently redirect the conversation. When relatives visited, Daniel included Lynn's voice in stories, sometimes even letting her take the lead in family matters. He learned to cook her favorite American comfort foods, grilled cheese, tomato soup, banana bread, sometimes with disastrous results, but always with affection. Their bedroom, once a place of retreat and silence, bloomed into a sanctuary for honest conversation and laughter. Outside the immediate household, the echoes of Lynn's resistance continued to ripple. Mai, emboldened by her cousin-in-law's courage, declared her major in art despite family pressure for a real job. Another cousin, long silent about her own struggles with tradition, confided in Lin late one night over cups of sweet, hot soy milk. Whispered thanks and quiet smiles from other young women at temple events made Lin realize just how many people had been following the old path in fear, too hesitant to seek change until inspired by another's audacity. Yet most important was how Lin had grown within herself. The compulsion to earn her place gave way to an unshakable knowledge. She was worthy, regardless of praise or criticism. She kept up her old journaling habit, filling notebooks with reflections, half-written letters to her younger self, and lists of moments when she'd felt most free. One entry, scrawled in her looping script after a particularly contented Sunday: "Courage is as much about small truths as it is about big choices. Sometimes endurance is wisdom. Sometimes resistance is survival. But I am allowed to want more than surviving. I am allowed to ask for joy." Lin began to carve out small rituals for her own renewal. She picked up watercolor painting again, setting a corner of the guest room aside for brushes and sketches of the orange trees and the old Nguyen house. She taught Daniel's niece to make cinnamon rolls, the American way, resulting in powdered sugar dusting every kitchen surface. She called her own parents with increasing candor, sharing not just her successes, but her mistakes and questions. For the first time, she felt at home in both languages. Neither Vietnamese nor English had to mask her true self. Spring edged toward summer, and with it came a series of new beginnings. A cousin's wedding, Daniel's long-awaited promotion, which he credited in part to Lin's insistence that he finally speak up at work. Mrs. Nguyen, after months of silent mending, suggested a trip to visit Lan in a distant city. It was an awkward, challenging journey, and Lin was asked to mediate over meals and memories. For the first time, she saw the generational scars from both outside and within, and realized that healing takes time and more than one person's courage. The family's traditions didn't dissolve, but they evolved. Rituals at the altar now included English translations for younger relatives. Meals were sometimes potlucks. Takeout pho from local shops imperfectly paired with Mrs. Nguyen's homemade pickles. Laughter became familiar again at the table, sometimes at Lin's sly jokes or Daniel's failed attempts to master chopsticks. Even the elders learned, haltingly, that love could expand to include change. Sometimes Lin thought of the years before, the girl who had first entered the Nguyen home, trembling with hope and dread. She had loved Daniel, but had almost disappeared inside her fear of not fitting in. Now she understood. True family was not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to see and be seen, courage intact, even through misunderstanding and pain. On the anniversary of Lin's arrival, the family gathered for dinner in the garden under strings of soft light. Lin brought out a cake she'd decorated herself, half frosted with lotus flowers, half with American buttercream roses. She served her mother-in-law a generous slice, accepting Mrs. Nguyen's embrace without hesitation. There was no speech, but later, as the sky turned violet and the last lantern flickered, Mrs. Nguyen whispered, "I'm proud you belong to us, and that you belong to yourself." That night, Lin stood in the stillness of her room, listening to the orchestra of family sounds, children's laughter, Daniel's guitar, her father-in-law's radio playing faint old songs. She recognized the lesson her journey had written. Patience, though invaluable, could become survival at the cost of joy. But patience wedded to courage and guided by self-worth became a force for freedom, for herself and all who loved her. Lin was not done growing into her new beginning, and neither was the Nguyen family. Yet, for the first time, she welcomed the uncertainty, the open future, bright with possibility. In daring to demand a life she could recognize as her own, Lin had found not just belonging, but a deeper kind of home.